Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her small Honda Civic and surveyed the bustling military base before her. Fort Braxton hummed with activity as young soldiers moved between buildings, their boots creating a rhythmic symphony on the concrete pathways. At 47, Sarah looked unremarkable among the crowd. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes that had seen better days. Nobody would guess that this quiet woman had spent nearly 3 decades serving her country in the most elite unit the Navy had to offer. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as Sarah made her way toward the visitor center. She had been invited to speak at a military appreciation event, though she wondered if anyone would actually listen to what she had to say. These days, it seemed like everyone wanted to hear from the flashy heroes with movie-worthy stories. Sarah's service had been different. Most of her missions remained classified, buried in files that would never see daylight. Her heroism lived in the shadows, in moments where silence meant survival and recognition meant death. As she approached the main building, Sarah noticed a commotion near the parking lot. A group of young soldiers had surrounded someone, their voices raised in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Sarah's instincts, honed by years of training, immediately kicked in. She altered her path slightly, moving closer while maintaining the appearance of casual interest. The center of attention was a young woman, probably no more than 22, wearing a military uniform that looked crisp and new. Her name tag read Johnson, and her face showed a mixture of defiance and fear that Sarah recognized all too well. The soldiers surrounding her were all male, their postures aggressive and intimidating. "Come on, Johnson," one of them was saying, his voice dripping with condescension. "You really think you belong here? This isn't some summer camp where everyone gets a participation trophy." Another soldier, taller and broader than the first, stepped closer to Johnson. "My dad served 2 tours in Afghanistan. My grandfather was in Vietnam." "What makes you think you have what it takes when you probably can't even do 10 push-ups?" Sarah paused at a nearby bench, pretending to check her phone while listening to the exchange. Johnson straightened her shoulders, meeting the tall soldier's gaze. "I earned my place here just like everyone else," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious pressure she was under. The first soldier laughed, a harsh sound that made several passing personnel turn their heads. "Earned? You mean because they needed to fill some diversity quota? Face it, sweetheart, you're out of your league." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She had seen this scenario play out countless times throughout her career. The military had changed significantly since she first enlisted, but some attitudes seemed to persist like stubborn stains. She remembered her own early days when proving herself meant working twice as hard for half the recognition. Johnson took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The soldiers had effectively boxed her in against a concrete barrier. "I passed the same tests as everyone else," she insisted. "I'm here because I want to serve my country." "Serve your country?" The tall soldier's voice grew louder, attracting more attention. "You want to serve? How about you start by making us some coffee? That's about all you're good for." The comment drew laughter from his companions, but Sarah noticed that several other personnel in the area had stopped what they were doing. Some looked uncomfortable with the scene unfolding, but none seemed willing to intervene. It was a familiar dynamic, the bystander effect combined with military hierarchy and social pressure. Sarah stood up from the bench, her decision made. She had spent her entire adult life fighting for her country, but some of her toughest battles had been fought right here at home, in situations exactly like this one. She walked toward the group with measured steps, her expression calm but alert. "Excuse me," Sarah said as she approached, her voice carrying just enough authority to make the soldiers turn toward her. "I'm looking for the visitor center. Could one of you point me in the right direction?" The tall soldier barely glanced at her before dismissing her with a wave. "Lady, can't you see we're busy here? Find it yourself." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his response. "I see. You're too busy harassing a fellow service member to help a veteran find her way around the base she's visiting." The word veteran seemed to catch their attention, though the tall soldier's expression remained skeptical. "Veteran? You? What did you do, work in admin for a couple years?" Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Something like that. She turned to Johnson, whose eyes showed a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Are these gentlemen giving you trouble, soldier?" Johnson hesitated, clearly caught between wanting help and not wanting to appear weak in front of her peers. It was a position Sarah understood intimately. "Nothing I can't handle, ma'am," Johnson replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Of course you can handle it," Sarah agreed, "but that doesn't mean you should have to handle it alone." She turned back to the group of male soldiers, her posture shifting subtly. Anyone with military experience would have recognized the change, the way her weight distributed, the slight positioning of her hands, the alert stillness that suggested coiled energy. "Look, lady," the first soldier said, stepping forward with obvious irritation. "This is none of your business. Why don't you just move along and let us sort this out?" Vera studied him for a moment, noting his uniform, his insignia, his general demeanor. "What's your name, soldier?" "Martinez." He replied automatically, then seemed to catch himself. "But I don't see how that's relevant." "It's relevant, Martinez, because when I file my report about this incident, I want to make sure I spell everyone's name correctly." The tall soldier, his name tag read Thompson, laughed outright. "Your report? Who are you going to report to, the base librarian?" Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. She flipped it open, revealing military identification that made Thompson's laughter die in his throat. The ID showed her current status as a retired Navy SEAL, along with security clearances that most of these young soldiers had never even heard of. "Actually," Sarah said conversationally, "I'll be reporting to Colonel Harrison, who invited me here to speak about military readiness and unit cohesion. I'm sure he'll be very interested to know how his soldiers treat their fellow service members." The atmosphere around the group shifted dramatically. Martinez and Thompson exchanged glances, their earlier bravado evaporating as the implications of the situation became clear. The other soldiers in their group had already begun to step back, recognizing that what had started as casual harassment had escalated into something potentially career-ending. Thompson, however, wasn't ready to back down completely. His pride had been challenged in front of his peers, and young men with wounded pride often made poor decisions. "Navy SEAL?" he said with forced skepticism. "Come on. You're what, 5'4"? You look like somebody's mom, not some elite warrior." Sarah pocketed her ID and took a step closer to Thompson. Despite the height difference between them, her presence seemed to fill the space. "You're absolutely right," she said quietly. "I do look like somebody's mom. That was always one of my greatest assets in the field. Nobody ever suspected the middle-aged woman in the corner." Johnson watched the exchange with growing amazement. She had hoped for intervention, but she hadn't expected this quiet civilian to completely turn the tables on her tormentors. "The thing about appearances, Thompson," Sarah continued, "is that they can be deceiving. For 29 years, I relied on people underestimating me. It made my job much easier." Martinez had clearly recognized that the situation was spiraling out of control. "Look, ma'am, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. We were just having a friendly conversation with Johnson." "Friendly?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call surrounding a fellow soldier and questioning her right to serve? Suggesting she's only here to fill a quota? Telling her to make coffee instead of defending her country?" The group had drawn a small crowd of onlookers, though most maintained a respectful distance. Sarah was aware of their audience, and she knew that how this situation resolved would send a message throughout the base. Young soldiers like Johnson needed to know they had allies, while soldiers like Martinez and Thompson needed to understand that harassment had consequences. "I'll tell you what," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly to the gathered crowd. "Since you gentlemen seem to have strong opinions about who belongs in the military and who doesn't, why don't we settle this in a way that honors military tradition?" Thompson's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "Physical training, right here, right now. If you can outperform this middle-aged mom in basic military exercises, then maybe your opinions about who belongs in uniform carry some weight." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Thompson looked around at his companions, then at the growing crowd of spectators. His masculine pride was now fully engaged, and Sarah could see him calculating the social cost of backing down versus the potential embarrassment of losing to a woman old enough to be his mother. "You're serious?" Thompson asked. "Dead serious," Sarah replied. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to continue picking on someone half your size instead of facing someone who might actually give you a challenge." Johnson stepped forward slightly, "Ma'am, you don't have to do this for me. I can fight my own battles." Sarah turned to her with a smile that was genuinely warm this time. "I know you can, soldier. But sometimes fighting your own battles means accepting help from your brothers and sisters in arms. That's what we do. We watch each other's backs." Thompson was trapped by his own earlier words and the expectations of his peer group. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "But when I embarrass you in front of everyone, don't come crying about it." "Understood," Sarah agreed. "Same goes for you." The crowd had grown larger, with personnel from various units gathering to watch what promised to be an unusual confrontation. Someone had even notified the base's fitness instructor, who arrived with official timing equipment and a knowing grin on his weathered face. "All right, people," the instructor called out. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Standard PT test format, push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run. Anyone who wants to back out can do so now with no shame." Thompson looked around at the assembled crowd, his jaw set with determination. "I'm not backing down." Sarah simply nodded, already mentally preparing for the physical challenge ahead. She hadn't retired from the military to avoid conflict. She had retired to choose her battles more carefully. This was definitely a battle worth choosing. As the two opponents prepared for their impromptu competition, Johnson found herself surrounded by other female personnel who had heard about the confrontation. Their presence was both supportive and symbolic, a reminder that the military's strength came from all its members, regardless of gender. "You sure about this?" Martinez asked Thompson quietly, his earlier aggression replaced by obvious concern. "She's got that look." "What look?" Thompson replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "The look that says she's been places and done things that we can't even imagine," Martinez said. "Maybe we should just apologize and walk away." But it was too late for that. The challenge had been issued and accepted, the crowd had gathered, and reputations were now on the line. Thompson had painted himself into a corner with his own arrogance, and Sarah had deliberately given him no graceful way out. The fitness instructor finished setting up his equipment and called both competitors to the starting line. "Standard rules apply," he announced. 2 minutes for push-ups, 2 minutes for sit-ups, then the 2-mile run. Best overall performance wins. Sarah removed her jacket, revealing arms that, while not bulky, showed the kind of lean muscle that came from decades of functional fitness. She had kept herself in shape throughout her retirement, knowing that a warrior's body was a tool that required constant maintenance. Thompson, meanwhile, looked exactly like what he was in, a young soldier in peak physical condition, with the kind of build that came from regular gym sessions and youth on his side. On paper, he should have dominated this competition easily, but wars weren't won on paper, and Sarah had learned long ago that victory often went to the competitor with the stronger mind, not necessarily the stronger body. As they prepared to begin, Sarah caught Johnson's eye and nodded slightly. This wasn't just about putting Thompson in his place. It was about showing every young service member watching that they belonged, that they had allies, and that the military was big enough for everyone willing to serve with honor. The fitness instructor raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. "Competitors ready?" he called out. Sarah settled into position, her mind already shifting into the focused state that had carried her through countless missions. Thompson flexed his shoulders, confident in his physical superiority and eager to prove his point to the assembled crowd. "Begin!" the instructor shouted, and the competition commenced. The next few minutes would determine more than just physical supremacy. They would establish whether the military was a place where might made right, or whether respect was earned through character, dedication, and the willingness to stand up for what was right. As Sarah began her first push-up, she wasn't thinking about winning or losing. She was thinking about a young soldier named Johnson who deserved better than harassment, and about all the other young soldiers who were watching this moment unfold. The real battle was just beginning. Sarah's first push-up was smooth and controlled, her form textbook perfect. Beside her, Thompson dropped into position with the confidence of youth, his powerful arms easily supporting his frame as he began his own repetitions. The crowd pressed closer, forming a loose circle around the two competitors as the fitness instructor began his count. 1, 2, 2, 6, 0, 0. 3. The instructor's voice carried across the parade ground, drawing even more spectators from nearby buildings. Word was spreading quickly through the base's informal communication network, the way military gossip always traveled at light speed. Thompson's push-ups were fast and strong, his competitive nature driving him to establish an early lead. By the 30-second mark, he had completed 15 repetitions to Sarah's 12. He glanced sideways at her, a satisfied smirk playing across his features. This was going exactly as he had expected, but Sarah wasn't concerned with the early pace. She had learned patience through decades of operations where rushing could mean death. Her push-ups maintained the same steady rhythm, each one executed with mechanical precision. Her breathing remained controlled and even, while Thompson was already showing signs of exertion. Johnson watched from the front of the crowd, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Part of her felt guilty that this woman, this stranger, was putting herself through this challenge on her behalf. Another part of her was amazed at what she was witnessing. Sarah's movements had an economy and efficiency that spoke of muscle memory built over years of training. As the first minute passed, Thompson's pace began to slow. His initial burst of energy had carried him to an impressive count, but maintaining that intensity was proving difficult. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her steady progression. Her form never wavered, her timing never faltered. 42, 43, the instructor called out, and several spectators began to murmur among themselves. Thompson was still ahead by 3 repetitions, but the gap was closing with each passing second. Martinez watched his friend with growing concern. Thompson's face was flushed red with effort, and his arms were beginning to shake slightly with each push-up. The cocky confidence that had started this confrontation was being replaced by grim determination and the dawning realization that he might have seriously underestimated his opponent. 1 minute remaining, the instructor announced. Sarah's internal clock was perfectly calibrated to the instructor's timing. She had been through countless physical evaluations, had pushed her body to its limits in training scenarios that these young soldiers couldn't imagine. This was just another test, and she approached it with the same methodical mindset that had kept her alive in hostile territory. Thompson, however, was discovering the difference between gym fitness and military conditioning. His workout routine was designed for appearance and strength, but Sarah's conditioning had been forged in environments where failure meant death. Every muscle in her body had been trained not just for power but for endurance and reliability under extreme stress. As the second minute progressed, the crowd could see the shift happening. Thompson's push-ups were becoming labored, his form beginning to break down as fatigue set in. Sarah's repetitions remained crisp and controlled, each one identical to the last. 58, 59, 60. The numbers continued to climb, but now Sarah was pulling ahead. Her steady pace had become an advantage as Thompson's sprint turned into a struggle. Several of the female personnel in the crowd had moved closer to Johnson, creating an informal support network around the young soldier. They understood the significance of what was happening. This wasn't just about physical fitness, it was about respect and belonging. "Come on, Thompson," one of his friends called out, but the encouragement carried a note of desperation. It was becoming clear that their confident predictions were not materializing. Sarah hit 70 push-ups and kept going. Her shoulders burned with the familiar fire of muscle fatigue, but her mind remained focused and calm. Pain was an old friend, a companion she had learned to acknowledge without letting it control her actions. Thompson managed 68 push-ups before his arms gave out completely, leaving him gasping on the ground. He had pushed himself harder than ever before, but it hadn't been enough. The crowd fell silent as the implications of the first event became clear. "Time!" the instructor called out. Mitchell, 73. Thompson, 68. The numbers hung in the air like a challenge to every assumption that had been made about the quiet woman who had wandered into their confrontation. Sarah stood up smoothly, showing no signs of the exhaustion that had left Thompson struggling to catch his breath. "That was just the warm-up," Sarah said quietly, offering Thompson a hand up. Her gesture was respectful, acknowledging his effort while making it clear that she was far from finished. Thompson stared at her outstretched hand for a moment before accepting the help. His pride was wounded, but he was beginning to understand that he was facing something entirely outside his experience. This wasn't the easy victory he had anticipated. 2-minute rest, then we moved to sit-ups. The instructor announced, consulting his stopwatch with professional efficiency. During the brief break, Sarah walked over to Johnson. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice pitched low enough that only the young soldier could hear. I should be asking you that, Johnson replied. You didn't have to do this for me. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face completely. Actually, I'm not doing this for you anymore. Now I'm doing it for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere they've earned the right to be. Around them, the crowd had grown even larger. Personnel from multiple units had gathered to witness what was becoming a legendary moment in base history. Word had even reached some of the officers, who were making their way toward the competition with expressions of curiosity and concern. Thompson used the break to collect himself, both physically and mentally. His friends gathered around him, offering advice and encouragement, but he could see the doubt in their eyes. The woman he had dismissed as a middle-aged civilian had just outperformed him decisively in an area where he had expected to dominate. Maybe she got lucky, Martinez suggested, but his words lacked conviction. Thompson shook his head. That wasn't luck. Did you see her form? It was like watching a machine. The fitness instructor called them back to the starting position for sit-ups. Sarah settled onto the ground with the same calm efficiency she had shown during the push-ups. Thompson took his position beside her, his jaw set with renewed determination. He couldn't let himself be embarrassed again. 2 minutes on the clock, the instructor announced. Begin! Thompson exploded into his sit-ups with desperate intensity, using his core strength and youth to build an early lead. His strategy was to create such a large gap that Sarah couldn't possibly catch up, but he was still thinking like someone who had only ever competed in controlled environments. Sarah, meanwhile, fell into the same steady rhythm that had served her so well during the push-ups. Each sit-up was executed with perfect form, her breathing controlled and her movements economical. She had learned long ago that consistency was more valuable than speed. As the first minute passed, Thompson maintained his lead, but the effort was costing him. His initial burst had carried him to an impressive count, but sustaining that pace was proving impossible. Sarah's numbers climbed steadily, each repetition bringing her closer to her opponent. The crowd had grown quieter, sensing the drama unfolding before them. This was no longer about harassment or military hierarchy. It had become a test of will, training, and character. Every person watching understood that they were witnessing something significant. Johnson found herself holding her breath as the competition continued. She had wanted someone to stand up for her, but she hadn't expected it to come in this form. Sarah's quiet confidence was inspiring, showing a different kind of strength than the loud bravado that had been directed at her earlier. 1 minute remaining, the instructor called out. Thompson's sit-ups were becoming labored, his early pace taking its toll on his core muscles. Sarah's rhythm never changed, each movement as precise as the last. Her decades of training had taught her how to manage her energy efficiently, how to maintain performance when others were fading. As the second minute progressed, the gap between them closed and then disappeared entirely. Thompson could hear Sarah's steady count matching his own labored efforts, and panic began to set in. This couldn't be happening again. 55, 56, the instructor's count echoed across the parade ground. Sarah pulled ahead at the 58 mark, her consistent pace finally overcoming Thompson's fading sprint. The young soldier pushed himself harder, trying to find reserves that were no longer there, but his body was beginning to fail him. With 15 seconds remaining, Sarah maintained her steady rhythm while Thompson struggled to complete each repetition. The difference in their training philosophies had become starkly apparent, his gym-based workouts versus her military conditioning. Time, the instructor called out. The final count was devastating for Thompson. Sarah had completed 76 sit-ups to his 64. The crowd murmured with amazement as the implications became clear. This quiet woman had now won 2 consecutive events against a young soldier in his prime. Thompson lay on his back, staring at the sky while trying to process what was happening. Everything he thought he knew about fitness, about military capability, about who belonged in uniform, was being systematically dismantled by a woman he had initially dismissed as irrelevant. Sarah stood up with the same fluid motion she had shown after the push-ups, brushing dust from her clothes with casual efficiency. She looked completely composed, as if she had just completed a light warm-up rather than a competitive fitness test. Final event is the 2-mile run, the instructor announced. 10-minute rest period, then we head to the track. During the break, more officers arrived on scene. Colonel Harrison himself appeared at the edge of the crowd, having been informed about the unusual competition taking place on his base. His expression was unreadable as he observed the participants and the gathered spectators. Sarah used the rest period to hydrate and perform light stretching, her movements economical and purposeful. She had run thousands of miles in her military career, on tracks and trails, through hostile territory and friendly bases. This was just another run. Thompson, meanwhile, was struggling with the psychological impact of his performance. His friends tried to encourage him, reminding him that running was his strongest event, but doubt had crept into his mind. This woman had already shattered his expectations twice. "She's got to be tired," one of his supporters insisted. "You're 25 years younger than her. The run is where you make up the difference." But Thompson wasn't sure anymore. Sarah's performance had been too consistent, too controlled. She wasn't fighting her body the way he was, she was working with it, using skills and knowledge that he was only beginning to understand. As the crowd moved toward the running track, Johnson found herself walking beside some of the other female personnel who had been watching the competition. Their presence felt like solidarity, a reminder that she wasn't alone in her struggles. "That woman is something else," one of them said quietly. "I've never seen anything like this." "She's proving a point," Johnson replied. "For all of us." The running track was a standard military installation, well-maintained and clearly marked. The instructor positioned himself at the starting line while the crowd spread out along the course to watch the final event unfold. Sarah and Thompson took their positions at the starting line. Both competitors were showing signs of fatigue from the previous events, but Sarah's breathing remained controlled while Thompson was still struggling to fully recover. 2 miles, the instructor announced, 8 laps around the track. First one to cross the finish line wins the overall competition. Thompson looked over at Sarah, studying her face for signs of weakness or doubt. What he saw instead was calm focus, the expression of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire adult life. "Runners ready?" the instructor called out. Sarah settled into her starting position with practiced ease. This was familiar territory, a test she had passed countless times in dozens of different environments. Running wasn't just exercise for her, it was meditation, therapy, and proof of capability all rolled into one. Thompson crouched beside her, his competitive instincts overriding his growing doubts. This was his last chance to salvage something from this confrontation, to prove that youth and strength could overcome experience and technique. The instructor raised his hand and the crowd fell silent. "Go!" he shouted, and both runners exploded from the starting line. Thompson immediately took the lead, using his youth and desperation to build an early gap. His strategy was simple: run fast enough early that Sarah couldn't catch up, regardless of her endurance. It was a high-risk approach, but his pride demanded nothing less than total commitment. Sarah settled in behind him, her pace measured and sustainable. She had run this race thousands of times before, against opponents who were younger, faster, and stronger. The key wasn't speed, it was intelligence, patience, and the absolute certainty that she could maintain her pace when others began to fade. As they completed the first lap, Thompson maintained his lead, but experienced runners in the crowd could already see the signs. His pace was too fast for the distance, his form showing the tension of someone fighting against fatigue, rather than working with it. Sarah's form, by contrast, was textbook perfect. Her stride was efficient and relaxed, her breathing controlled and rhythmic. She looked like she could maintain this pace indefinitely, which, based on her training history, was probably close to the truth. The second lap saw Thompson still ahead, but the gap was no longer growing. Sarah had found her rhythm, settling into the meditative state that long-distance runners knew well. Her mind was calm and focused, her body operating on decades of muscle memory and conditioning. By the third lap, the crowd could see the shift beginning. Thompson's early pace was taking its toll, his form beginning to break down as lactic acid built up in his legs. Sarah maintained her steady rhythm, each step identical to the last, each breath perfectly timed to her movement. Johnson watched from the side of the track, her heart pounding with excitement and anxiety. This final event would determine more than just the winner of an impromptu competition. It would establish whether respect was earned through character or simply assumed through prejudice. As they entered the fourth lap, Sarah began to close the gap. Her patient strategy was paying dividends as Thompson's unsustainable pace finally began to fail him. The crowd murmured with anticipation as the two runners drew closer together. Thompson could hear Sarah's steady footsteps behind him, growing closer with each stride. Panic began to set in as he realized that his desperate gamble was failing. He tried to increase his pace, but his body was no longer responding to his commands. With 4 laps remaining, Sarah pulled alongside Thompson. She glanced over at him with an expression that was neither triumphant nor mocking. It was the calm assessment of a professional evaluating a situation. "Pace yourself," she said quietly, her breathing still controlled despite the extended effort. "It's a long race." The comment was meant as genuine advice, but it had the psychological impact of a knockout punch. Thompson realized that while he was struggling to maintain his pace, Sarah was still composed enough to offer coaching advice. As they entered the 5th lap, Sarah pulled ahead. Her lead was small but steady, growing with each stride as Thompson's form continued to deteriorate. The crowd could sense the inevitable conclusion approaching, but they continued to watch with fascination. The final 3 laps became a demonstration of everything Sarah had learned about endurance, mental toughness, and the power of consistent preparation. While Thompson fought against his own body, Sarah worked with hers, using techniques and knowledge acquired through decades of professional training. By the 7th lap, Sarah's lead had grown to nearly 50 yards. Thompson was still running, his determination preventing him from quitting, but his pace had slowed to little more than a jog. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by grudging respect for an opponent who had systematically dismantled every assumption he had held. As Sarah entered the final lap, the crowd began to applaud. This wasn't just a victory, it was a lesson in humility, preparation, and the danger of judging people by their appearance. Sarah crossed the finish line with the same controlled form she had maintained throughout the race. Her time was impressive by any standard, but more importantly, she had proven her point conclusively and definitively. Thompson finished nearly 2 minutes later, exhausted and humbled but still on his feet. As he crossed the finish line, Sarah was there waiting for him, offering water and a respectful nod that acknowledged his effort. The crowd erupted in applause, not just for Sarah's victory but for the lesson they had all witnessed. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "That," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is why we never judge a book by its cover in the United States military." The crowd gradually dispersed as the immediate excitement of the competition faded, but the impact of what they had witnessed would resonate through Fort Braxton for years to come. Sarah accepted congratulations graciously while Thompson sat on a nearby bench, still processing the complete reversal of his expectations. Colonel Harrison approached Sarah with measured steps, his weathered face showing the kind of respect that one warrior gives to another. "Miss Mitchell," he said formally, extending his hand. "I believe we need to talk." Sarah accepted the handshake, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that marked Harrison as a career military officer. "Colonel," she acknowledged, "I hope I haven't disrupted your base too much." Harrison's laugh was genuine but rueful. "Disrupted? You've given my personnel the most valuable training exercise they've had in months. Walk with me." As they moved away from the dispersing crowd, Johnson approached Thompson, who was still sitting on the bench with his head in his hands. Despite everything that had happened, she felt compelled to check on the young soldier who had started the day as her tormentor. "You okay?" she asked, settling beside him on the bench. Thompson looked up at her, his earlier aggression replaced by something that might have been shame. "I'm an idiot," he said quietly. "A complete and total idiot." "You're not an idiot," Johnson replied, surprising them both with her generosity. "You're just young and maybe a little too sure of yourself." Thompson studied her face, looking for signs of mockery or satisfaction, but finding only genuine concern. "Why aren't you gloating? I was horrible to you earlier." Johnson was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "Because that woman just taught me something important. Being strong doesn't mean tearing other people down, it means lifting them up even when they don't deserve it." Meanwhile, Sarah walked alongside Colonel Harrison toward the base's administrative building, their pace unhurried despite the significance of their conversation. Harrison had served long enough to recognize the rare combination of skills and character he had just witnessed. 29 years as a Navy SEAL, Harrison said, not quite making it a question. That's an extraordinary career by any measure. Sarah nodded. It was my honor to serve. Though, I suspect you didn't ask me to walk with you just to discuss my service record. Harrison smiled at her directness. No, I didn't. What happened out there wasn't just about physical fitness. You handled that situation with a level of tactical awareness that most of my officers would envy. They paused at the entrance to the administrative building, and Harrison gestured toward a quiet seating area outside his office. You turned what could have been a simple harassment incident into a teaching moment that will be discussed in this base's barracks for months. Sarah settled into one of the chairs, her posture relaxed but alert. Those young soldiers needed to learn something that can't be taught in a classroom. Sometimes experience is the only teacher that really matters. Harrison leaned forward, his expression growing serious. Tell me about your service, Sarah. The real service, not just the highlights from your official record. For a moment, Sarah was silent, her mind sifting through decades of memories that ranged from mundane training exercises to operations that had changed the course of history in ways the public would never know. How could she summarize a lifetime of service in a single conversation? You want to know what it was really like, she said finally. Being a woman in the SEALs during an era when most people didn't even know women could serve in combat roles. I've read your file, what parts I have clearance to see. But files don't tell the whole story. Sarah looked out across the base, watching young soldiers go about their daily routines with the casual efficiency that marked professional military personnel. The hardest battles weren't always against the enemy, she began. Sometimes they were against the assumptions of people on our own side. She told him about her early training, when instructors would create scenarios specifically designed to break female candidates. About missions where she had to prove herself not just once but repeatedly, to teammates who couldn't see past their preconceptions. About the loneliness of being the only woman in units where acceptance had to be earned through performance rather than simply granted through presence. But you persevered, Harrison observed. I had help, Sarah acknowledged. Not from everyone, but from enough people that it made the difference. Leaders who cared more about capability than conformity. Teammates who learned to trust skill over stereotypes. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Thompson and Johnson, walking together in what appeared to be serious discussion. Both young soldiers looked uncertain about interrupting the conversation between their colonel and the woman who had just redefined their understanding of military service. Harrison noticed their approach and gestured for them to join the conversation. Come, he said. I think you both have something to contribute to this discussion. Thompson hesitated, clearly uncomfortable about facing Sarah again after his earlier behavior. Johnson, however, stepped forward with the kind of courage that had earned her a place in military service despite the obstacles she had faced. Ma'am, Johnson said to Sarah, I wanted to thank you for what you did out there, but I also wanted to ask you something. Go ahead. How do you keep going when it feels like everyone around you thinks you don't belong? When every day feels like you have to prove yourself all over again? The question hung in the air with the weight of genuine need. It was the kind of query that could only come from someone living the reality of being different in an institution that prized conformity. Sarah considered her response carefully. This wasn't just about advice, it was about passing down hard-won wisdom to the next generation of warriors who would face similar challenges. You remember why you're here, she said finally. Not why other people think you're here, but why you chose to serve. When you're clear about your own motivations, other people's opinions become much less important. Thompson, who had been listening intently, finally found his voice. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for the attitude I've been carrying around. I thought I understood what military service meant, but I was only seeing part of the picture. Sarah studied the young soldier, noting the genuine remorse in his expression. This was the moment that would define whether the day's lesson had actually been learned or simply performed for the sake of appearance. What do you think you understand now that you didn't before? She asked. Thompson was quiet for several moments, clearly struggling to articulate thoughts that were still forming in his mind. I thought being strong meant being the biggest, the fastest, the loudest. But watching you today, I realized that real strength is quieter than that. It's more like confidence without the need to prove anything. Sarah smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had shown Thompson all day. That's a good start, but understanding is just the beginning. The real test is what you do with that understanding. Colonel Harrison had been observing the exchange with the kind of attention that senior officers paid to moments of genuine learning. "Thompson," he said, "what are your thoughts on leadership after today's experience?" Thompson straightened slightly, recognizing that his colonel was asking a serious question that deserved a thoughtful response. "I think I've been confusing leadership with dominance, sir. Real leadership seems to be more about serving others than being served by them." Johnson looked surprised by Thompson's insight, but Sarah nodded approvingly. "Leadership in the military isn't about commanding respect through fear or intimidation. It's about earning respect through competence, character, and the willingness to put the mission and your people before your own ego." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martinez and several other soldiers who had witnessed the earlier competition. They approached the group hesitantly, clearly uncertain about whether they would be welcome in the discussion. Harrison noticed their approach and made the decision to expand the conversation. "Join us," he said to the newcomers. "I think we're having exactly the kind of discussion that needs to involve as many people as possible." As the group settled around the seating area, Sarah found herself surrounded by young soldiers who were looking at her with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and something that might have been awe. It was a familiar position. She had spent much of her later military career mentoring younger service members who were trying to navigate the complex world of professional military service. "Tell us about your missions," Martinez said, then quickly added, "I mean, whatever you can talk about." Sarah laughed softly. "Most of the interesting stuff is still classified and will be for the next 50 years. But I can tell you about the lessons, about what I learned from working with some of the finest warriors this country has ever produced." She talked about the importance of preparation, of training not just your body but your mind for situations that couldn't be anticipated, about the value of teamwork in environments where individual heroics could get everyone killed, about the discipline required to maintain peak performance when failure meant not just personal defeat, but the potential loss of teammates and mission objectives. "The movies make it look glamorous," she said, "but most of military service is about doing ordinary things extraordinarily well, day after day, year after year. The spectacular moments happen because of all the mundane moments that prepare you for them." Johnson raised her hand slightly, a gesture that made Sarah smile at its formality. "Yes? How do you deal with people who don't want you to succeed? I mean, not just people who doubt you, but people who are actively hoping you'll fail." Sarah's expression grew serious. This was the question that went to the heart of her own experience, to the battles that had been fought not against foreign enemies but against domestic prejudice and institutional resistance. "You succeed anyway," she said simply, "not to spite them, but because your service is bigger than their limitations. When you focus on being the best version of yourself, other people's negativity becomes irrelevant." Thompson leaned forward, his earlier hostility completely replaced by genuine interest. "But didn't it make you angry, having to work twice as hard for half the recognition?" Sarah nodded. "Of course it made me angry. Anger can be a useful emotion if you channel it properly. I used my anger as fuel for training harder, studying more, and pushing myself to levels of competence that couldn't be denied or dismissed." Colonel Harrison had been listening to the exchange with growing appreciation for the natural teaching ability that Sarah demonstrated. "You know," he said, "I was planning to have you speak to our officer candidates tomorrow about military readiness. After today's demonstration, I think we need to expand that audience significantly." Sarah looked surprised. "Colonel, I'm not sure that's necessary. Today was just about addressing a specific situation. Today was about leadership, character, and the kind of values that make the military strong," Harrison replied firmly. "Those lessons need to be shared as widely as possible." As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the base, the informal gathering gradually broke up, but not before Sarah had exchanged contact information with several of the young soldiers. They had approached her not as a celebrity or curiosity, but as a mentor who had demonstrated something important about what military service could mean. Thompson was among the last to leave, approaching Sarah with obvious hesitation. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I know I don't have the right to ask this after how I acted earlier, but would you be willing to help me understand how to be better, not just as a soldier, but as a person?" Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity versus mere performance. What she saw was a young man who had been genuinely humbled by the day's events and was trying to figure out how to grow from the experience. Being better isn't about grand gestures, she told him. It's about small choices made consistently over time. Treat people with respect, especially people who can't do anything for you. Take responsibility for your mistakes. Put the mission and your teammates before your own comfort. Thompson nodded seriously. That sounds simple, but I suspect it's a lot harder than it sounds. Sarah smiled. Most worthwhile things are. As the young soldiers finally dispersed to their evening duties, Sarah found herself alone with Colonel Harrison in the gathering twilight. The base around them was settling into its evening rhythm, the day's activities giving way to the quieter routines of military life. "You've given my people something valuable today," Harrison said thoughtfully. "More valuable than any training exercise or classroom instruction could provide." Sarah looked out across the base, thinking about all the young men and women who were learning to navigate the complex world of military service. "Every generation has to learn these lessons for themselves," she replied. "The best we can do is share what we've learned and hope they build on it, instead of repeating our mistakes." Harrison nodded. "Tomorrow's presentation is going to be standing room only. Word about today's events has already spread throughout the base." Sarah sighed softly. "I never intended for this to become such a big deal. I just saw a young soldier who needed someone to stand up for her. And in standing up for her, you reminded all of us why we serve in the first place," Harrison replied. "Not for glory or recognition, but because protecting others is worth the sacrifice." As they walked back toward the parking area, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her day had taken. She had come to Fort Braxton expecting to give a routine speech to a small group of military personnel. Instead, she had found herself in a situation that had required her to embody everything she had learned during her decades of service. The real victory hadn't been in outperforming Thompson in the fitness competition. It had been in transforming a moment of harassment into an opportunity for learning and growth. That was the kind of leadership the military needed, the kind of strength that built institutions rather than tearing them down. Johnson appeared at her car just as Sarah was preparing to leave, the young soldier's expression showing a mixture of gratitude and determination that reminded Sarah of her own younger self. "Thank you," Johnson said simply. "Not just for today, but for showing me what's possible. I won't forget this." Sarah smiled, seeing in Johnson's eyes the same fire that had carried her through her own challenges and obstacles. "Remember," she said, "you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be persistent. The military needs people like you. People who are willing to serve despite the obstacles." As Sarah drove away from Fort Braxton, she couldn't help but smile at the irony of the situation. She had retired from active duty thinking that her fighting days were behind her, but today had reminded her that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the uniform you wore. The next generation of military leaders was in good hands, she decided. They just needed to be reminded occasionally of what they were capable of achieving.